How many people are disappointed that I actually showed up? They were looking forward to that early happy hour, I'm sure. So yes, hi. I'm not the person that was slated originally to give this talk, but ironically, it turns out that my friend and colleague who was going to do it sent the paper in, and it turns out that I also actually ran platforms for 7 years in a previous life. So it actually works out really well. And platform engineering, platform as a product, they're all products disciplines that I'm super passionate about. So I'm happy to kind of like help out and give a talk today. So yeah, my name's Tony. I'm an avid mountain biker. I also work at VMware, but I promise you there's nothing in here that I'm going to try to sell you today. It will also be the least technical talk that you'll probably attend all week. I don't think I've coded in several years. My role at VMware is mostly around executive consulting and advising. So what I do is I work with a lot of really large enterprises, and I ask very important people why over and over and over until they're super, super annoyed at me. Yeah, it turns out that that's pretty effective. Prior to VMware, I did spend 9 years at a very large home improvement retailer. I'll let you all kind of guess who that is. And then I spent 7 of those years creating and then running our developer experience and technology enablement groups, where we went through the full gamut of adding UX, adding agile, cloud migrations and adoption, agile transformation, like the whole gamut. So a lot of experience in that space. And so I did want to share some lessons learned today with how that went. I will also preface this by saying I usually give some form of this talk to platform or infrastructure or development communities. This is my first time giving it to a community who I'm assuming are mostly SREs by the nature of this conference. I will try to be as inclusive as I can. When I was at my previous retailer, SREs were a huge customer of mine as a platform team as well, so I'll try to kind of sprinkle some of that in as necessary. So yeah, so where are we? So this was a slide that I gave at a different conference back in 2015 before, platform, right as platform as a product was sort of emerging. I think all the cool kids today are sort of calling it something else, platform engineering. I've also heard, this new thing like internal development platform or IDP, which is not to be confused with this other IDP, which is internal developer portal, which is also a part of a platform. So it's like a whole mess. But the point is, we're talking about platforms today, and specifically how lessons learned in sort of exposing those to development communities and customers and treating it as a product. This is the so what slide. So again, in my role, in my current job, I get a lot of executives asking me so what. I think there was a comment at the end of the last talk, right? Asking businessy people. Like that's who I talk to most of my time now is businessy people, but the so what slide. So I think one of the interesting things in this DevOps movement and journey that we've been on for several years, and anyone who understands sort of the foundation of agile and lean thinking, for a long time we've sort of intuitively believed that DevOps is a good idea, or DevSecOps now, right? Like it's all evolving. But it hasn't been until the last few years where we've actually been able to sort of quantify and measure the exact impacts of these things. And so there are a slew of studies and white papers and research papers, all backed by academic scrutiny, that tells us that automation, self-service, providing platforms where it minimizes coordination between groups, these are really good ideas. But not only that, they're super valuable to customers and to companies. And so when we talk about sort of automating and platform, there are studies out that something like this where it says companies that have a high developer velocity index, they have annual growth that is 4 to 5x those of companies that do not. That's the box on the left. The box on the right, it also says they're 55 times more innovative, but I have actually no idea how you measure that or what that means. So there's a link to the paper. I'll have to go back and check that out, or if you went to yourselves. But there's also other studies that show that companies that provide a very good developer experience have very good bottom line results for their companies. So what is a platform? That is a very good question. It looks, in its most basic generic form, something like this. This is from the CNCF working group. I think it was late last year they kind of put this together. I think the way I define it is it's a place you run apps, and it sort of sits in this place that is between your traditional infrastructure groups and your application or your business, business unit teams, right? And so it's really where it's where the rubber hits the road. It's where the developers have to interact with some sort of services that are being provided by an infrastructure group or being exposed. One of the things that's kind of new, because this diagram's kind of been around in some way or form for a while, is the top there where it says platform interfaces. And so in the last couple of years, we've seen a resurgence sort of in like the documentation. I think for a while, agile principles and lean principles sort of gave documentation a bad name. Like, I don't think that's true anymore. In fact, it's been one of the themes that I've seen today in a lot of the talks is the need for documentation. Not for documentation's sake, obviously, but sort of organic documentation. But the bottom line is that development communities need a place to go and look for answers. And so we're seeing the birth of internal development portals and in-house search solutions, documentation, warehousing, and that sort of thing. So this is a very generic form of this, though. But what I think we see over time is that there's sort of these 3, 5, 7-year cycles, depending on what you're looking at. So we have these big advancements in some technology, and then we build platforms around this technology, and then we have some other big technology that comes out, and we have to build another platforms around these technologies. And this just never ends, right? This only goes back to 2007. We have Heroku, Cloud Foundry, which is where I kind of cut my teeth on platforms. And then we have this thing that happened, one of those big disruptions, Kubernetes containers, which I sort of internally with friends over drinks say it's something along the lines of the biggest technology distraction we've faced in several years. And then where everyone's struggling like, hey, let's build platforms around containers and Kubernetes. And the reason for that is because like all these other technological disruptions, like when they're first coming out, they're not really that simple to use. And so there's a lot of companies, mine included, but I'm going to be as unbiased as possible, that are trying to solve this problem of how do I make Kubernetes more accessible and consumable and easy to use, not just for developers, but SREs. So I'm trying to be inclusive here. So you stand up Kubernetes, and this is what it looks like. So this is not a platform. I think we all agree, right? So this can be a little overwhelming, and this is also why I think a lot of companies that are looking to make this migration to containers struggle. Is that we have these groups internally that do a lot of this work in planning, and they build, and then it's like, congratulations, you have kubectl, like now what? And so we know we have to do a little bit better. Evan from ThoughtWorks back in 2018, the way he defined platform was a digital platform is a foundation of self-service APIs, tools, services, knowledge, and support, which are arranged as a compelling internal product. And that word product comes up again. Later in this quote, though, he also talks about with the lack of coordination. And I think that is a very important part of what a good development platform is. So without further ado, we will get into what I think are some of the most compelling lessons learned from running successful platforms. And again, it's not just from my personal experience, like while I was at that previous company, doing the things that we were doing at the time, it did give me the unique opportunity to talk to a lot of different companies and peers who were also trying to do similar things, often with different technology stacks. But at the same time, in my current position, I actually get to spend even more of my time doing that, but I actually get paid for it now as opposed to volunteering before. So that's exciting. All right, so lesson 1, you have to adopt a product mindset. And so there's a lot of things that go with that. And I think most of us are familiar with some of the traditional product mindset thinking about articulating a vision and a strategy and roadmaps and backlogs and prioritization. I'm not going to talk about any of those things because I think most of us who are in this industry are familiar with those. We do those to various levels of success. But what I do want to talk about are some of the other things that product-minded groups do that, in my experience, platform or infrastructure people aren't typically as versed in. So these include things like learning, marketing, measuring, iterating. So my first big advice is, as a platform group or an infrastructure group, get product help. Like it's a skill, it's a science, it's an art form. And you have enough hats to wear as thought leaders and technical leaders at your company. I think it's very important to get product help. And in fact, one of the first things I did when I took over platforms at my company was I hired platform and UX people, and I think I made everyone's heads explode, and they're like, what are you talking about? Like, we're not even set up for that. Those aren't roles that exist in our org structure, and yada, yada, yada. And the reason for that was because when I took over platforms for this company in 2015, I knew zero about infrastructure or platforms. I didn't know what VMs were. I didn't know, like, I mean, if you think it sounds silly, I knew nothing. So I did what any self-respected IT person did, and I faked it until I made it. And then what I really did is I took what I did know, which was agile product application development coming from an application background, and I applied all of those same principles to platform engineering, which turns out to have been a really cool idea. Sort of on accident, but I'll say it was on purpose. So the reason why technical people aren't very good at this, in my opinion, so this is a very non-technical talk, but it's a very opinionated talk. So we'll have lots of drink conversations afterwards. But the reason being is if anyone's familiar with this sort of three lens or Venn diagram over to the right, most engineering groups sort of focus on that feasible circle. And so we like to build things, we like to look at the new and latest, greatest technologies, but then we have hard times answering those businessy questions that kind of came up at the end of the last talk, like how do I know what to build, how do I know what to prioritize? And so with that, you sort of have to be able to incorporate these other two circles. And so really good product management is about finding the best balance and overlap of all three of these things. Do people want to use it? Can we actually do it? And is it good for our company? And so that's what product management is really good for. And so I highly recommend that in your respective roles or companies or organizations that you look to incorporate product owners and managers into your platforms and infrastructure. The second thing is learning. So part of the product mindset, right, is discovery and learning. This can be market research, user research, competitive research. There's a bunch of research that goes into it. And I think what I'm going to limit this to today is sort of like user research. And usually when I give this talk, that means developers. But I do want to also say that this is actually really important for SREs as well. One of the biggest challenges that we had when we ran the platform is that it was super easy to use, so a bunch of people did very quickly. But then when we got into war rooms and incidents, it became very difficult in the early days to figure out like, well, who's supporting what, and like who knows about this, and what are the dependencies, right? And then as SREs sort of wrapping their hands around the product and these big integrated solution platforms, like they start asking some really interesting questions, right? Like you're talking about multi-tenancy, you're trying to figure out the difference. Is it like an infrastructure problem or an application problem? Is it a platform problem, right? And so having a platform that's able to answer all of these questions is very important. So I don't want to undersell SREs as one of the users that you have to research. But one of the most valuable exercises that I still do in my current role and that we did in my previous role was this notion of a value stream map. And anyone who's familiar with lean thinking or the lean process kind of knows what this is or has done any systems engineering, right? Talking about critical paths and so forth. But essentially what I would like to do is you get all the people in the room necessary to go from an idea to that idea in production, and you sort of document and you whiteboard that entire process. And what it turns out, for those that don't know, is that these boxes tend to reflect pretty accurately either the teams or organizations within your company, or at least the functions of those teams. But the real magic is all of the arrows between the boxes. So this is where either inputs, artifacts, forms, approval processes, permission, whatever that is, these are the handoff points between the points, the different teams and parts of your organization. This is where the most waste tends to happen. And so when we kind of go back to that definition of a good platform where it talks about with the least amount of coordination, really what we're talking about is eliminating these arrows, or at least the waste and the hold time associated with these arrows. And so what you're really trying to do is you're trying to create a very streamlined process to go from ideation to production that requires sort of no manual handoffs or approval between teams, which most infrastructure teams tend to operate, with tickets and queues, right, or support hotlines and so forth. But then other groups do it with Excel, and so it just becomes a huge mess. So we know automation's good. There's also journey maps, golden paths. I won't go into all the details. But the point is, similar to the first point, is that this also is a skill, and it's an art, and there's a science to it. And so with this, I highly recommend hiring UX help, researchers. So these are people that tend to be very good at getting information from users and documenting that information in a way that makes sense for everyone. The other thing that this is really important about, or important for, is that if you ever want to get a large amount of facepalm emojis to pop up in a room at the same time, like bring in a bunch of leadership and representation from all of these little boxes and teams together and map this out over 3 or 4 days. Because most people are very familiar with sort of the bottlenecks within each box. But when you look at sort of the cycle time and the holding time and the waste that occurs between the boxes, like this is a really good way to get greenlit on like anything that you want to do around automation. Because you're able to sort of articulate like, where the gaps in like delivery time are happening through coordination within the different teams. Here's an example of some interview example questions. So again, in addition to that value stream map, one of the things that I did in my previous company is that we came up with this sort of voice of engineer type survey. And this would go out to all engineering people in the organization, like either every quarter or every 6 months. And again, it's just more data. And so the point of this, we'll get to this in a moment about measuring, is that you also want to be able to kind of track things over time and have a lot of these really cool data points. Anyway, you take that value stream map, you take some of the data, eventually you kind of come up with a golden path, some sort of architectural diagram or flow that represents the ideal to-be state when you go from ideation to production. You map out some dependencies, and so this notion of a golden path kind of becomes sort of a North Star that you kind of can start working towards. All right, moving on to the third thing, lightning rounds here. The first two things are pretty easy because most of the time you can hire a product owner. Most companies have a UX organization. UX people tend to be very helpful. And so even if you don't hire one, you can typically go to them and say, hey, will you run this workshop for me for 4 days, at least in the early days, right? So you're able to do that. This one is one that most infrastructure, platform, and SREs kind of have to just take upon themselves. And I think this is the one that for most companies that I talk to, they have the hardest time sort of wrapping their heads around and getting started. And this is the notion of branding, marketing, and training. So if you think about it, you get a platform up and working. Now you have to worry about adoption. How do we get people to use it? How do we understand what our users care about? So there's a lot of different ways to do this. You can have internal sort of conferences. You can have roundtables. We used to have a dev forum all the time where we'd rent out the auditorium. Teams would come and demo like things they've been working on, sharing best practices. There's a resurgence of documentation. Now people are liking to put together wikis and portals and books and placemats. And so there's a lot of different ways to do this. But the problem is that unfortunately, especially in the beginning, it's difficult to justify or rationalize hiring a team of people to do this. I also think that it kind of erodes some of the empathy building and trust building that you can do between infrastructure and development groups if you don't do this yourselves. So I highly recommend that you sort of take on this extra responsibility of being an advocate and just kind of meeting your users where they are and engaging with them on a regular basis. This is an example from Mercedes-Benz. The link here, by the way, there's a lot of links. I'll send this out afterwards, but if you want to go and kind of see what they did, but this was a quote from one of them on their platform team. For my teams at my previous employer, Home Depot, this was one of the mantras. This was sort of our main slogan as we went through that journey. Make the easy thing and the right thing the same thing. Again, I came from a UX background a little bit, and you're taught that the best products are ones that solve two sort of opposing motivational factors at the same time. And so, I like to say, developers, technical people, it's like Jurassic Park, like they find a way, right? If there's anything standing in their way or, slowing them down or they are told no, they'll find a way. Like they just gravitate towards the path of least resistance. And then meanwhile, you have these infrastructure shared services teams that are like, no, we have to be good corporate citizens, and what about security and regulatory and compliance and data privacy? And so really, our mantra was like, hey, like, why can't we do both? And we know that's hard, but like the end state is to do both of those things at the same time. Getting back to metrics, so measuring the right thing. This is a fantastic book I recommend. It's sort of the follow-up to the Phoenix project, I believe, the DevOps handbook, sorry. But the DevOps handbook was that book that's sort of like, hey, we should all do these things, and everyone's like, yeah, that sounds great. It makes sense. Automation's good. Dr. Nicole Forsgren was sort of the first person that I'm aware of who actually put like academic scrutiny around these studies and proved that those things actually are measurable and quantifiable. And so if you're ever interested in those businessy conversations, right, and ROI, like this is a very good book to read. And in fact, this was sort of like onboarding material for every one of my teams. The other thing I would say is there's a lot here. Don't boil the ocean. When you're starting out, the simplest thing to start with is deployment frequency. And the reason for that is most companies probably have some form of this data laying around either in ServiceNow or somewhere. And so you can already build up a historic trend of that like before your new platform, and then you can kind of compare it to after. The other thing that I think is really interesting about this that doesn't get talked about enough is most infrastructure platform teams, SRE groups, in my opinion, they have a really hard time sort of articulating to the boots on the ground like what the impact of their work is. And so like if you're on the business team or the mobile app team, like it's really easy. Like you know who your users are, you know what the feedback is, you know what your impact to the company is. But I think this gives you a language for articulating the impacts that your work has behind the scenes on your company. And it does really help build morale and kind of give you something to put on information radiators that gives everyone a sense of pride and accomplishment. The only thing I will caveat with this is be mindful of sort of weaponizing metrics. We don't want to fall into that trap. And so this book actually has an entire section on talking about that as well. This might be the most controversial one. Again, we're all engineers. We like to build things. I think we're all, in my previous employer, we had slogans around do it yourself. But I highly recommend that you start with an integrated solution already and then customize from there. I think that everyone underestimates the cost and effort of DIY. And I'm going to say that, and again, I usually give this talk to like infrastructure people and platform people, and I know with them I'm never wrong. I think SREs are much more sort of acclimated to metrics and dollars and cents and numbers, so maybe I need to give you all a little bit more credit. But I assure you, there's a non-zero number of people in this room that are like, no. I know the effort of DIY, and like even you are wrong, I promise you. So there's a lot of things that go into DIY. And I'll go into the main reason why I think this is wrong. So I listed some of them here, but none of that matters. So we're just going to move on to that. So anyway, you take that other diagram, and you come up with some integrated solution that solves a lot of these bullet points, and it kind of packages something up for you. And it makes it really easy to install, and you kind of get people to start using it very quickly. And that's great. Well, here's the reason why I think that's important to do. Because it turns out the technical part of the impacts you're trying to do with your company is actually the easiest part. And so think of all the meetings you're going through, right, to figure out which open source technologies do we pull in, how do we cobble those together, how do we expose these scripts and repositories, how do we get the dial tone, the networking segmentation. Like you get all of these things and all these approval processes, and then you get back and you have that Kubernetes dial tone or that cursor or the platform, right? Like that's the easy part, actually, as it turns out. The hard part is everything that comes after that. So one of the things that we ran into, for example, is our IT controls were written in such a way that we couldn't even use the platform the way it was intended to run. So the platforms nowadays, right, like you can write code, test code, it gets scanned and tested, whatever. A developer, in theory, can invoke processes that will automatically deploy it. Well, if your IT controls are worried about segregation of duties and separation of concerns, and it's actually written in your IT controls that the person that writes code can't deploy it, well, that's a problem for DevOps. And so that's only one example. The other examples are sort of like, what does your PMO process look like, right? Your budgeting, your financing. How does your company turn things into portfolios and products and applications? How do you track all that asset management? Is it automated? And so what happens is when you get the technology in place and you start using it, you quickly run into all of the cultural and process issues, and those take much longer to fix, but they're also much more impactful. And so for me, I think the most valuable thing you can do, especially when you consider technology cycles are happening every 3, 5, 7 years, is you get to those hard problems as quick as you can, and those are going to be the ones that stick with you and outlive any sort of technology that you replace under the covers. And so by changing the process, the IT controls, the org structures, the culture, you're going to make it much easier to sort of adapt and go through technologies much quicker as they evolve. And the other thing too is that these are expensive, and it's a single line item, and so I know a lot of people sort of balk at that. But I promise you, when you do sort of the analysis and ROI, and you add up all of the costs across all of the different facets of your company, the value is there. And then it actually makes it much easier later when you customize or justify cost outs from there. But then it allows all your company to get better with these technologies much quicker. So when you get these in place, everyone becomes Kubernetes experts, right? Then it makes it much easier to talk about, we don't need that anymore. We can drop that out. We can stop paying for this, and we can use this instead. All right, so how to get started. So, this is one thing. This is what we did. But again, I think it's going to be different for every company, but this is a good place to start. You need a dedicated platform team. And that means having someone on the product side, operators, engineers, advocates, and so forth. I recommend picking one app. There's a whole process for sort of rationalizing that app choice. Again, can we do it? Does it make sense for the business? But also, I think you want to pick one that's real. You want something that's going to go to production. But you don't want something where if you stumble, it's going to bring down the company. You're going to be out millions of dollars. So you got to find the right app. You want to develop or audit sort of the developer toil, right? That value stream map. You want something that represents the thing that you're correcting or improving, or something that articulates what the bottlenecks and challenges are. Then you want to work together to sort of figure out what the ideal to-be state is. I recommend starting with a pre-integrated solution or platform for that. Again, it's the fastest way to kind of get to the real important hard part, which is your culture, your process, and your org structures. And then from there, you work together as a group and you build a golden path. This is the ideal to-be state. And then it says optionally, but I don't know if this is optional anymore. But you do need some sort of portal. You need some way for people to go and seek each other out, share, ask questions, and search for answers. But you do this for 3 months. And so most of the time when I give this talk, everyone laughs when I say 3 months. But again, going back to that integrated solution, this is totally doable in less than 3 months when you do that. Then the question is, how do you scale that? So I'll give you, I think in my previous role, we had over 4,000 engineers, multiple business units. We had, I think, 99-point-something% adoption of that platform within 12 months. And that was without a mandate to use it. It was all willful adoption. And in fact, going back to things you measure, it's one of the reasons that I get CEOs, CFOs, CIOs all the time saying, yeah, I'm just going to tell everyone to use this. And I'm like, well, I don't know if that's the best idea. And the reason for that is because you lose one of your most valuable metrics, which is do people actually want to use this? And so for us, we got nearly 100% adoption across our 4,000 engineers, in about 12 to 16 months. But anyway, what you do is you want to brand and market that platform. You want to start finding a couple more apps. There's this process, again, we adopted pairing, right, from, Extreme XP and application development into our infrastructure group. And what I mean by that is we had the people working on the platform and the technology, but then we also rotated a pair of support engineers every week who would just talk to customers, do that engagement, the advocacy, the support. We had no tickets. Everything was on Slack. So as you can imagine, 4,000 engineers. There's a whole process for that, for doing ticketless support and so forth. But anyway, so you take people from one of that first app team, those engineers, and you kind of take 1 or 2 of them and you seed them on a new team and a new app, and you just start cross-pollinating this every couple months. And then soon you start to get like this sort of exponential growth kind of in adoption. The reason why I bring it up is because it does take a long time. So at the Home Depot, the journey, it's still on the journey, right? Takes several years. Started in 2015. We started getting a lot of adoption around 2016, 2017. And then, you get into every year after that, and then you start talking about business outcomes and productivity gains and so forth. And so what I want to say is it starts slow, but it does ramp up very quickly. So just don't be discouraged early on if it's not happening as quickly as you would like. And then the other thing is don't take my word for it. There's a lot of companies that have done some amazing things. This is JP Chase, I believe, and some slides they put together, a deck they have around their process for doing this. I included a link to that. I encourage you to go check it out. You'll see a lot of similarities, right? It's being user-centric, treating your engineers as users, thinking about product, the right things to measure, building empathy. These are all things that are really important. So with that, thank you very much. I wanted to leave some time for questions and to let people get off to happy hour at a decent time. The colleague of mine that originally was slated to do this talk, Michael Cote, he's very entertaining, and he's also way smarter than I am. He has an awesome newsletter. I recommend you go check it out. If you're interested in reaching out to me or have any questions or concerns, the best way to reach me is on LinkedIn. I don't really check email. My boss hates that. But yeah, so it's Anthony McCulley on LinkedIn, but I go by Tony. I do want to open it up for questions if anyone has any.
Well, thank you, Tony.